Lyra had always been different, and she knew it. From the moment she could understand the world around her, she felt like an outsider. People avoided her gaze, children never played with her, and even her own family kept their distance. It wasn't that she was mean or cruel, quite the opposite. Lyra had a heart full of kindness, ready to give love to anyone who would take it. But somehow her presence made others uncomfortable. She wasn't sure why, but she could see it in their eyes. The fear, the uncertainty. It was like something inside her made her invisible to the world, something they couldn't explain, but something they all felt. Every day, Lyra would walk through the streets of her town, watching the others laugh, talk, and live. She couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to belong, to be part of something. Yet every time she tried to approach, every time she smiled, she was met with cold shoulders, turning backs, and whispers. "There she goes again," she would hear them mutter, just loud enough for her to catch the sting of their words. It was as if she was an inconvenience, a puzzle that no one could figure out, and they weren't interested in solving. She spent hours in the quiet of her room, staring out the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, wishing for something, anything, that would make her life feel like it mattered. She had tried everything to change, to be like the others. She wore clothes that were in style, tried to speak the way the other girls did, and even forced herself to smile in ways that felt unnatural. But nothing worked. No matter how much she tried to fit in, it was clear that the world had already made up its mind about her. The rejection was suffocating, and as the days passed, she found herself growing more and more withdrawn. Even when she spoke to her family, she felt the distance between them. Her mother, though kind, never truly saw her. Her father would often give her distant, distracted glances, as though he wasn't sure how to connect with her either. Lyra began to wonder if there was something wrong with her, if she had been born with a flaw, something that made her unworthy of love and friendship. But she didn't know what that flaw was, and no one was willing to tell her. Her loneliness weighed heavily on her soul. It was a quiet kind of pain, the kind that doesn't scream but instead lingers like a shadow, always there, but never noticed. She would lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, and wonder if there was a place for her in this world, a place where she could finally be seen, understood, and accepted. But every time she tried to imagine that future, it felt like it was just out of reach, a dream that was too distant to touch. One evening, as she sat alone in the park, her thoughts turned darker. The sun had long since set, and the cool breeze carried the scent of the earth as the city buzzed in the distance. Lyra pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, trying to hold herself together. She had spent most of her life trying to fit into a world that didn't seem to want her. How much longer could she endure this? The world, with all its noise and laughter, seemed to mock her isolation. Every face in the crowd appeared so happy, so full of life, while she remained a stranger to it all. Her heart felt as though it might break from the weight of it all. What was the point of living if she could never truly be a part of anything? She closed her eyes and let out a sigh, feeling the chill of the night air on her skin. It seemed that no matter where she went or what she did, she would always be an outsider, forever invisible in the crowd. Little did Lyra know, the very thing she feared the most, the thing that had haunted her for years, was about to change. But how it would change, and what it would mean for her future, was something she could never have imagined. One morning, Lyra woke up to a strange feeling, as though the world around her had shifted while she slept. The sun's warm light streamed through her bedroom window, but there was something different about it. She felt human. It was a strange thought, almost a foolish one. Of course, she had always been human. But now, for some reason, the word seemed to carry a weight that she couldn't quite explain. She sat up in bed, her heart racing with an unfamiliar energy. The air felt thicker around her, as if it held the promise of something new. Her fingers trembled as she brushed a lock of hair from her face, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the soft, tangible sensation of her own body. As she looked at her hands, the faint glow of her skin seemed to shimmer slightly, almost as though it were a mirror to her inner self, reflecting a newness, a change that she could not yet comprehend. Lyra stood from her bed, her feet making soft contact with the cold wooden floor beneath her. A chill ran through her, not from the temperature, but from the sudden realization that something had indeed changed. She glanced around her room, and everything looked the same, yet the familiarity of it all felt off, almost as if she had been away for a long time, and returned to find things slightly altered. But this was no ordinary change. This felt deep, like something inside her had finally clicked into place. Without thinking, she rushed to the bathroom, her breath catching as she approached the mirror. The reflection that stared back at her was hers, and yet it wasn't. Her eyes that had always held a tinge of sadness, of something otherworldly, now sparkled with life. Her hair, usually messy and untamed, fell in soft waves around her face, looking softer, more radiant. She touched her cheek, feeling the smoothness of it, and a small gasp escaped her lips. Her skin looked flawless, like someone who had always taken care of themselves. But she hadn't. She had always been too lost in her isolation to bother with such things. Her heartbeat quickened as she stared at herself in disbelief. The changes were subtle but undeniable. She wasn't imagining this. The Lyra who had woken up this morning was not the same Lyra who had gone to sleep the night before. She was different. She was human, in a way that she had never been before. 1,000 questions flooded her mind, each one more urgent than the last. How had this happened? What had caused this change? And most importantly, was this change permanent? She had lived her life feeling like an outcast, a being stuck between worlds, neither fully human nor anything else. But now, in this moment, she felt like she had stepped into a new reality, one where she might finally be able to fit in. She slowly dressed herself, the clothes feeling strange against her now soft skin. She had always felt awkward in her own body, but now, the fabric of her clothes seemed to embrace her in a way she had never experienced. She felt a sense of freedom, as if she were stepping into a new chapter of her life, one that held endless possibilities. As she made her way outside, the world felt more vivid than it ever had before. The wind brushed against her face, and she marveled at how alive everything seemed. The trees, the birds, even the simple sounds of the street felt different. It was as if she had been blind all her life and had suddenly been given the gift of sight. But with this gift came uncertainty. What was she supposed to do with this new life, this new form? She had no answers, only questions. Lyra wandered the streets, her mind racing. The people she passed didn't seem to notice her. They went about their business, laughing, talking, living their lives as if nothing had changed. But for Lyra, everything had changed. She couldn't stop the nagging thought in her mind. What if this is just a dream? What if the world she now saw, the world that suddenly seemed open to her, wasn't real? But then, as she reached for a small flower growing in the grass, the soft petals beneath her fingertips reassured her this was real. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe she could fit in now. Maybe she could finally find a place where she wasn't invisible. Her heart beat faster as she imagined what her life could be like. She had always been rejected, cast aside by those around her. But now she had been given a chance to start over, to find the connection she had longed for. But as much as her heart swelled with possibility, a part of her remained fearful. The fear of rejection still lingered deep inside her, a silent whisper in the back of her mind. Would the world truly accept her, now that she was human? Or would she once again find herself standing alone, on the outside looking in? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the new sense of freedom that she felt. She was human now. She had to believe that this was her opportunity to make a change, to find a place where she belonged. And with that thought, Lyra took her first step forward, not knowing where it would lead but determined to walk the path that had been given to her. Her journey had only just begun. Lyra's days blurred together as she navigated her new reality. At first, everything seemed like a dream. The new world around her felt so alive, so vibrant, as though she had awakened from a long sleep. She marveled at the sensation of feeling truly human, the way her feet made contact with the ground, the way her heart beat in her chest, the way her breath moved through her lungs. Every moment was an experience she had never known before, and for the first time, she allowed herself to be present, to truly live. Yet, as the days went on, the novelty of being human began to fade, replaced by a heavy sense of uncertainty. There were moments when Lyra would catch herself staring at strangers, watching them interact with ease, laughing and engaging with one another. They seemed to know exactly how to fit in, how to be a part of the world. It was as if they had learned all the rules of life, all the unspoken codes of conduct that made human connection so effortless. But for Lyra, it wasn't so simple. She still felt like an outsider, still felt the pull of her old loneliness, even though she now walked among the crowd. She tried to blend in, tried to do what she had always seen others do. She wore clothes that were in style, spoke when spoken to, and smiled when appropriate. But no matter how much she tried, something always felt off. Her movements were stiff, her gestures awkward. She wasn't sure how to start a conversation, how to make a joke, or even how to respond when someone asked her how her day had been. There were so many things she had never been taught, things that others learned naturally but had always been foreign to her. She found herself mimicking the behavior of those around her, trying to fit into a mold that she wasn't sure how to shape. It wasn't just the small, everyday interactions that made her feel out of place. It was the deeper sense of connection that eluded her. She could see it in the eyes of others when they spoke to each other, the way they shared a knowing glance or a laugh, the ease with which they understood each other's unspoken words. She longed for that kind of connection, that sense of belonging. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't seem to bridge the gap. She was still that strange girl on the outside, watching the world spin by without truly understanding how to join in. Lyra began to feel the weight of her new existence pressing on her, the joy of her transformation slowly replaced by a suffocating sense of doubt. She wanted so badly to fit in, to have someone, anyone, look at her and see the person she was inside. But all she saw in the eyes of others was uncertainty, just as she had seen when she was different. The world still saw her as an enigma, a puzzle that couldn't be solved. She had become human, yes, but she still didn't know how to be part of the world. She often found herself wandering through the city, hoping that by simply walking, by simply existing, she might find something that would help her make sense of it all. She would find herself sitting on a park bench, watching couples and groups of friends laughing together, talking, sharing stories. It was a beautiful sight, but it only made her feel more isolated, more aware of the space that separated her from them. One afternoon, as Lyra sat on the same bench she had visited countless times before, something unexpected happened. She saw him, Ethan. At first, she wasn't sure why he caught her attention. He was just another face in the crowd, like so many others. But as he passed by, their eyes met, and for a brief moment, something shifted. There was a quiet recognition in his gaze, something that made Lyra's heart flutter in a way she hadn't expected. He didn't look at her like the others did. He didn't look away, didn't dismiss her with a glance. He simply looked, as though he was truly seeing her for the first time. She quickly looked away, embarrassed by the intensity of the moment, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about him, something that felt different from everyone else. She watched as he continued walking, and for a split second, she imagined what it might be like to speak to him, to ask him about his life, to see if he might understand her in ways the others never could. The next day, she found herself returning to that same bench, hoping for another chance encounter. And, as if fate had a hand in it, there he was again. Ethan passed by once more, his eyes catching hers as though drawn by an invisible force. This time, she didn't look away. Instead, she held his gaze, allowing herself to feel the curiosity and the hope that had been bubbling inside her. And in that moment, something unexpected happened. He smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Enough to make Lyra's heart race and her cheeks flush. They didn't speak that day. He simply walked by, but the connection was undeniable. Lyra couldn't explain why, but she knew she had to see him again. The loneliness that had haunted her for so long seemed to melt away in that single moment. Maybe there was still hope. Maybe she could still find someone who would understand her, someone who wouldn't see her as the strange, awkward girl she had always been, but as the person she truly was inside. The next day, Lyra found herself at that bench again, her heart pounding in her chest, hoping that fate would give her another chance. And when Ethan appeared once more, she knew that this was the moment she had been waiting for. This time, she didn't hesitate. She stood up, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. "Hi," she said, her voice soft but steady. Ethan stopped in his tracks, looking at her with the same calm intensity that had drawn her to him in the first place. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the world around them fading into the background. And in that silence, Lyra felt something shift deep inside her, a quiet hope, a spark of something that told her that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. For the first time in her life, Lyra felt as though she might finally belong. The following days felt like a blur for Lyra. Each moment spent with Ethan, no matter how brief, felt like a dream she was desperately trying to hold on to. At first, their interactions were small, a smile exchanged on the park bench, a nod as they passed by each other on the street, brief words that never lingered but left an undeniable warmth in her chest. Yet with every passing day, it became harder to ignore the growing connection between them. It was like a thread, delicate yet strong, weaving its way between them, invisible to the world but undeniable to both. Ethan was different from the others. Where others had turned away, where they had given her the cold shoulder, he seemed to see her, really see her. There was no judgment in his gaze, no hesitation or fear. When their eyes met, there was a sense of understanding that Lyra had never experienced before. It was as if he could look right through the walls she had built around herself, as though he could sense the person she was underneath all the doubts and insecurities that weighed her down. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, Lyra found herself waiting at the park again. It was a quiet evening, the air cool and crisp as the world around her began to settle into the peaceful lull of twilight. She sat on the same bench, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her jacket as she waited for Ethan to appear. She told herself she wasn't sure why she was waiting. After all, it was just a chance encounter, nothing more. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just coincidence that had brought him into her life. There was something more, something that she couldn't quite put into words. When Ethan appeared, walking down the familiar path through the park, Lyra's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't noticed her yet, and she watched as he strolled past, his hands in his pockets, his gaze focused ahead. But as if sensing her presence, he slowed his pace and turned his head, his eyes meeting hers once again. This time, there was no hesitation, no shyness. There was a quiet confidence in his expression, as though he knew what was about to happen, as though this moment had been coming for longer than either of them had realized. He stopped in front of her, his gaze lingering for a moment before he spoke, his voice soft but steady. "Mind if I join you?" Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She had been waiting for this moment. But now that it was here, she found herself unsure of what to say. She nodded quickly, unable to form the words that were swirling in her mind. She moved over to make space for him on the bench, and he sat down beside her. The silence between them was comfortable, not awkward like she had imagined. It was as if they were both silently acknowledging the shift that had taken place between them, as though they both knew this was the beginning of something new. "I've been seeing you here a lot lately," Ethan said after a moment, his voice light but warm. "You always seem to be alone. Are you waiting for someone?" Lyra bit her lip, unsure of how to answer. She had been waiting for him, but it felt strange to admit it. Still, she found herself drawn to the sincerity in his eyes, the way he listened without judgment, without expectation. She shook her head gently. No one. I just like the peace here. It's quiet. Ethan nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. I get that. Sometimes you just need to be alone to think, you know. Lyra smiled softly, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. It was so simple, so ordinary, but in that moment, it felt like the most significant conversation she had ever had. For once, she wasn't trying to hide or fit into some mold. She was just there, present with someone who seemed to understand her in ways no one else ever had. They sat together in silence for a while, the only sounds being the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Lyra couldn't help but steal glances at him, studying his profile, the way his features softened in the fading light. He looked like someone who had lived a full life, someone who had seen both joy and pain, someone who understood the complexities of the world without needing to explain them. He wasn't perfect, she knew that, but there was something about him that made her feel less alone, less like an outsider. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan finally spoke again, his tone thoughtful. You seem like someone who's been through a lot. You don't have to talk about it, but if you ever want to, I'm here. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to say that, hadn't expected him to offer such understanding without question. No one had ever said those words to her before. I'm here. It sounded so simple, so genuine. She wanted to respond, to tell him everything, about her past, about her transformation, about how she had always felt like she didn't belong. But the words were stuck, lodged in her throat, just out of reach. Instead, she nodded, offering him a quiet smile. She didn't need to explain everything. Not yet. Maybe not ever. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her own. Ethan was here, and that was enough for now. As the evening wore on, they continued to talk. At first, the conversation was light, the kind of small talk that people make when they don't quite know each other. But slowly they began to open up, sharing fragments of their lives, their dreams, their fears. Lyra found herself speaking more freely than she had ever done before, telling him about her experiences, her loneliness, and how she had always felt like she didn't belong. Ethan listened intently, his gaze never wavering, never judgmental. He didn't try to offer solutions or tell her that everything would be fine. He just listened. And that, in itself, was enough. As the night deepened, the park grew emptier, the last few stragglers heading home to their lives. But Lyra didn't feel the same emptiness she had once felt. For the first time, she felt connected to another human being, not because of some grand gesture or dramatic event, but because of the quiet, simple moments they had shared. As they stood up to leave, Ethan turned to her with a gentle smile. I'll be here tomorrow. Same time, same place. I hope I see you again. Lyra's heart swelled with a mix of emotion. Hope, fear, excitement. She had no idea where this would lead, no idea if this was the beginning of something lasting. But in that moment, with the warmth of his presence beside her, she knew that things were different. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found the place where she finally belonged. The days that followed were filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension for Lyra. She met Ethan every evening at the park, and each time they spoke, it felt like a small piece of the puzzle that had been her life was finally falling into place. But as much as she was drawn to him, there was a part of her that still held back, a part that kept her from fully embracing the connection that seemed to be growing between them. Lyra couldn't help but wonder if this was all too good to be true. She had spent so long in isolation, so long convinced that she didn't belong, that the sudden shift in her life was almost overwhelming. It felt like everything had changed so quickly, and she found herself struggling to keep up with the new emotions that stirred within her. She had never allowed herself to feel this much before, never allowed herself to want something, to desire something with such depth. The fear that had always haunted her, the fear of being rejected, of being misunderstood, lingered in the back of her mind. She had spent years living in the shadows, carefully avoiding the pain of disappointment by keeping people at arm's length. But now, with Ethan, things felt different. He saw her, truly saw her, and the thought of losing that, of somehow ruining the fragile bond they had built, terrified her. It wasn't just Ethan that scared her, though. It was the whole idea of belonging, of allowing herself to be part of something bigger than herself. She had always kept her distance, telling herself that she didn't need anyone, that she could survive on her own. But as she spent more time with him, she realized how much she had longed for connection, for acceptance. She had always been afraid that if she let someone in, they would see the broken parts of her and turn away. But Ethan didn't seem to see her brokenness. He saw her whole, in a way that no one ever had. One evening, as they sat on their usual bench in the park, the sky painted with the soft hues of twilight, Lyra's thoughts were more restless than usual. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that the fragile peace she had found would soon be tested. Ethan was talking about his day, something small and trivial, but as he spoke, Lyra's mind wandered. She had been carrying her past with her for so long, the weight of it pressing down on her every moment. She had never allowed anyone to see the scars she carried, the wounds that still ached deep within her, the parts of herself that she could never fully explain. Ethan noticed the shift in her energy, the way her smile faltered, the way her eyes seemed distant. He stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowing in concern. "Lyra, what's going on? You're not yourself tonight." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't meant to show him that side of her, the side that was still so fragile, so raw. But the question hung in the air between them, and she knew that there was no escaping it now. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, as she tried to find the words to explain the swirling storm inside her. She trailed off, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure what to do, Ethan. I spent my whole life feeling like I don't belong, like I'm invisible to everyone. And now, for the first time, I feel like I might actually be seen. But it scares me. It scares me because I don't know how to be this person who actually matters. I spent so long hiding from everything, from everyone, because I thought it would be easier that way. But now, with you, I want to be someone I don't know how to be." Ethan didn't say anything at first. He simply sat there, his gaze soft and understanding, as if he wasn't surprised by her words, as if he had already sensed the inner turmoil she had been trying so hard to keep hidden. He reached out, placing a hand gently on hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to figure everything out right now, Lyra," he said quietly. "You don't have to be anything you're not. You're enough just as you are. You don't have to carry your past alone. If you want to share it with me, I'll listen, but you don't have to rush. We have time." Lyra felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes stinging with the force of emotion she had long suppressed. She wanted to speak, to tell him everything. The loneliness, the rejection, the constant fear that had followed her throughout her life. But the words felt too big, too overwhelming. She wasn't ready to face them yet. Not all at once. Instead, she nodded, a small, shaky smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Thank you for being here, for seeing me." Ethan squeezed her hand, his gaze never leaving hers. "Always," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not going anywhere, Lyra." Those words, simple as they were, meant more to Lyra than she could ever explain. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just existing, she was living. She was finally allowing herself to feel, to connect, to be seen. And for the first time in her life, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to be afraid of being vulnerable. Maybe there was strength in letting someone else in letting them see the parts of her that she had spent so long hiding. But even as her heart swelled with a new sense of hope, the fear still lingered, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind. What if this was all a dream? What if in the end, she wasn't truly worthy of this connection, this love that was starting to bloom between them? Lyra didn't have the answers, and for once, she wasn't sure she needed them. All she knew was that, in that moment with Ethan by her side, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of possibility. Maybe the future wasn't so uncertain after all. Maybe, with him, she could finally find the strength to face her past and move forward. But for now, she was content to simply be in the moment, to sit beside him and let the silence speak louder than words. And for the first time in a long time, Lyra felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The days grew longer as Lyra and Ethan's connection deepened, like two threads weaving together into something neither of them had expected. Each moment with him felt like a step into uncharted territory, a place where Lyra could shed the weight of her past and simply be herself. But with each passing day, as her trust in him grew, so did the fear. The fear that what they had was too fragile, too fleeting. The fear that she would be rejected once again, the same way she had always been. Despite Ethan's reassuring words, despite the comfort she found in his presence, the old wounds that Lyra had carefully buried deep within her began to stir. It was a quiet evening when the silence between them became louder than the words they spoke. They sat on their usual bench in the park, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow over everything. The air was still, and the world felt suspended in a moment of calm, but inside Lyra's mind, the storm was brewing. She had spent so much of her life hiding from the truth, hiding from the parts of herself that she couldn't face. She had never allowed anyone to see her vulnerabilities, her weaknesses, the things that made her feel small and insignificant. And now, with Ethan by her side, she could feel those walls beginning to crumble. She wanted to let him in, wanted to share her heart with him in a way she had never done with anyone before. But the fear held her back, a gnawing feeling that no matter how much he cared, no matter how much he seemed to understand, he could never truly accept all of her. The conversation they were having was light, casual, but Lyra's thoughts drifted as her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. Ethan noticed the change in her, the way her gaze became distant, the way her smile faltered. He paused, his expression shifting with concern. "Lyra," he said gently, his voice soft. "What's going on? You've been quieter than usual. Is something wrong?" The question was simple, but it hit Lyra like a wave. She felt her heart race, her throat tighten, the familiar weight of her fears pressing down on her. She couldn't lie to him. Not now. Not when he had been so patient, so understanding, so willing to see her for who she truly was. But the words she needed to say, felt like a heavy stone in her chest, stuck there, just out of reach. "I don't know how to do this," she finally whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't know how to be the person you see. I don't know how to be this person who's worthy of what you're offering." Ethan's brow furrowed, confusion clouding his features. "What are you talking about? You don't need to be anyone else but yourself. You're enough just as you are, Lyra. I care about you because of who you are." But Lyra shook her head, the weight of her past crashing over her like a tidal wave. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't know everything. I've spent my whole life being invisible, being rejected, and I've gotten so used to it. I don't know how to let someone love me. I don't know how to believe that I'm worth it." She looked down, her fingers twisting tighter together, as the tears she had been holding back began to spill. It was the first time she had allowed herself to be this raw, this vulnerable, and it terrified her. But the fear of losing Ethan, of losing what they had, pushed her to speak the truth. "I've never been enough for anyone, Ethan. I've always been wrong somehow, not quite right. And I'm scared that, in the end, I'll never be able to let go of that. That you'll see the real me, the broken me, and walk away like everyone else." There was a long, heavy silence between them as Lyra's words hung in the air. She expected him to pull away, to say something that would make the distance between them wider. She expected him to turn his back on her, just like everyone else had done when they saw her for what she truly was. But instead, Ethan did something she hadn't anticipated. He reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands, his touch warm and steady. His eyes held hers with a quiet intensity, a depth that seemed to see all the parts of her she had kept hidden for so long. "Lyra," he said softly, his voice full of conviction, "I don't want you to be perfect. I don't need you to be anyone other than who you are. The broken parts, the scars, the things you think make you unworthy, those are the things that make you real, that make you human. I see you, all of you, and that's what matters to me." Lyra's breath caught in her throat as his words sank in. She wanted to pull away, to retreat back into the safety of her fears, but something about the way he spoke, the sincerity in his eyes, made her feel as though she could trust him in a way she had never trusted anyone before. He wasn't asking her to change. He wasn't asking her to be perfect. He was asking her to be herself, all of herself, the parts she had hidden away, the parts she thought were unlovable. For the first time in her life, Lyra allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to hide anymore. Maybe it was okay to be vulnerable. Maybe it was okay to let someone love her, not despite her flaws, but because of them. "I'm scared," she admitted softly, her voice trembling. "I'm scared that if I let you in, you'll see everything I've been hiding, and you'll leave, that you won't want me anymore." Ethan's grip on her face tightened just slightly, a reassuring pressure. "I'm not going anywhere, Lyra. I'm here. I'm not afraid of your scars. I'm not afraid of your past. I'm here for you, every part of you." For the first time, Lyra let herself believe him. She closed her eyes, allowing his words to wash over her like a healing balm. She didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to hide. Ethan had seen her for who she truly was, and he hadn't turned away. He had stepped into her world, choosing to stay. And in that moment, Lyra realized that she didn't have to carry the weight of her fears alone. She didn't have to face her past alone. Ethan was there, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be enough. Her heart swelled with a new, quiet hope, and as she looked into Ethan's eyes, she finally allowed herself to let go of the past and step into the future, one small step at a time. The days passed slowly, each one carrying Lyra a little further from the person she had been before, and closer to the woman she was beginning to become. The walls that had once encased her heart, the walls built by years of rejection and isolation, were gradually starting to crumble. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of her past pressed down on her, reminding her of all the reasons she had been afraid to hope, to dream, to believe. But every time doubt crept in, every time fear whispered its familiar lies, she would remember Ethan's words, the way he had seen her not as a broken soul, but as a person worthy of love, worthy of belonging. She found herself thinking about the future more often, imagining what it might look like if she could continue walking this path with Ethan by her side. For so long, she had believed that happiness was something out of reach, something reserved for others, those who had it easy, those who didn't carry the weight of their pasts with them. But now, with Ethan, she began to see that maybe happiness wasn't about being perfect. Maybe it was about being true to yourself, about letting go of the fear of being seen and accepted for who you truly were. One evening, as they walked together through the park, the sky stretched wide above them, in shades of deep purple and gold. The air was cool, and the sounds of the city seemed distant, muffled by the quiet stillness that surrounded them. Lyra's hand rested gently in Ethan's, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt at peace. The fear that had always threatened to choke her, the fear that had kept her from truly living, was still there, but it wasn't as loud, not anymore. Ethan had become a constant in her life, a steady presence that anchored her, and yet it was more than just his presence that brought her comfort. It was his belief in her, his unwavering faith that she could be more than the sum of her past. He had seen her when she was at her lowest, when she felt like she had nothing left to give, And he had stayed. He had stayed when others had turned away, when she had been nothing more than an outsider in her own life. And now, as they walked together, Lyra couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision that lay ahead of her. She had spent so much of her life holding back, afraid of letting anyone in, afraid of being hurt, of being rejected. She had built walls around her heart, convinced that if she kept herself hidden, no one could ever see the broken parts of her. But now, standing beside Ethan, she realized that she didn't want to live like that anymore. She didn't want to hide from love, from connection, from the possibility of a future that could be filled with hope and joy. "I've been thinking a lot," Lyra said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "about us, about the future, and about what it means to truly be seen." Ethan looked at her, his eyes warm and understanding, as though he had known she had been carrying these thoughts for a while, but had been waiting for her to voice them in her own time. He squeezed her hand, gently encouraging her to continue. "I've always been afraid, Ethan," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "afraid that if I let someone in, they'd see the parts of me that I've spent my whole life trying to hide. The parts that I thought were too broken to be loved. But with you, I don't feel that fear anymore. Not as much. And that terrifies me, because it means I'm trusting you in ways I never thought I could trust anyone." Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her fully. He took her hands in his touch warm and steady. "Lyra," he said, his voice soft but filled with conviction, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm here. I've always been here, and I always will be. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have it all figured out. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for you. Just you. The real you." Tears welled up in Lyra's eyes, and she swallowed hard, trying to hold them back. The vulnerability she had been carrying for so long, the fear of being seen and rejected, seemed to pour out of her all at once. But this time, it wasn't painful. This time, it was freeing. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking again. "I'm ready, Ethan. I'm ready to trust you. To trust us. I don't know what the future holds, but I want to face it with you. I want to let go of the fear that has held me back for so long." Ethan's smile was small but genuine, a soft curve of his lips that spoke volumes. "Then let's do it, Lyra. We'll face the future together. We'll take it one step at a time. No rush, no pressure. Just us, walking side by side." In that moment, Lyra realized that the future didn't have to be something to fear. It didn't have to be full of uncertainty and doubt. It could be something beautiful, something full of hope and possibility. For the first time, she truly believed that she deserved happiness, that she was worthy of love, and that she didn't have to face the world alone. As they continued walking, hand in hand, Lyra felt the weight of her past lifting off her shoulders. She was no longer defined by the mistakes, the rejection, or the pain that had once held her captive. She was defined by the woman she was becoming, the woman who was ready to embrace love, to embrace the future, and to let go of the fear that had kept her in the shadows for so long. Ethan had been the catalyst for this change, the person who had seen her when no one else had, the person who had believed in her when she had lost faith in herself. And now, as they walked into the unknown together, Lyra knew that whatever the future held, they would face it as a team. They would face it together. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly alive. The future was no longer a distant, uncertain dream. It was a reality she could reach out and touch, one step at a time. And with Ethan by her side, Lyra knew that no matter what challenges they might face, they would always have each other. And that, in itself, was enough.